She forced the city's most dangerous man to sing in front of thousands. What happened next? His voice would haunt her forever. The moment Elizabeth Finley grabbed that microphone at the Metropolitan Gala and called Theodore Voronkov to the stage, everything changed. She had intended to humiliate the Mafia boss with a single improvised performance. Nothing more. But the way the entire ballroom stopped, stared, held its breath, and waited made it clear that nothing about that moment would end the way she planned. And what happened when he sang? No one, not even Elizabeth, was ready for it. Everyone in that glittering hall knew that Theodore Voronkov did not perform. He eliminated. He controlled. People disappeared. That was why the entire room went silent when Elizabeth's voice rang out sharp and crystalline across the marble floors, her words wrapped in velvet cruelty. "Theodore, darling, come sing for us." Before continuing the story, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more stories to you. Theodore Voronkov looked up from his champagne, fingers pausing around the crystal stem. He had been standing in the shadows near the grand staircase, a ghost in an immaculate tuxedo, his presence alone keeping the crowd at a careful distance. His dark eyes were unreadable, his jaw set like stone, his reputation too deadly to challenge. People rarely dared to speak his name aloud, but everyone watched now. He set down his glass, adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate precision, and began walking toward the stage. Elizabeth smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had never lost. The smile of a diva who owned every stage she touched. Her sequined gold gown caught the chandelier light as she stood there, microphone in hand, certain she was about to destroy the one man in the room more powerful than she was. But Theodore's footsteps were steady, unhurried, and when he reached the stage, when he took the microphone from her perfectly manicured fingers, when his eyes met hers with a cold, knowing gleam, Elizabeth Finley realized she had made a terrible mistake. The Metropolitan Gala was Elizabeth Finley's kingdom, and she wore her crown with the kind of confidence that came from never having been dethroned. She floated through the ballroom like light through crystal, her gold sequined gown catching every flicker of the chandeliers above. Cameras followed her. Conversations paused when she passed. Men straightened their ties. Women checked their lipstick. The air itself seemed to hum in her presence, vibrating with the electric charge of celebrity. This was her world. These people, the politicians, the oil magnates, the tech billionaires, the aging actresses clinging to relevance, they all existed in her orbit. She had opened the gala with a performance that left the crowd breathless. 3 songs. Perfect pitch. Flawless runs that climbed octaves like staircases built for gods. The standing ovation had lasted 4 minutes. For glorious, validating minutes where she stood center stage, bathed in adoration, reminding everyone why her name was still on every billboard from New York to Tokyo. But now, an hour into the evening's festivities, Elizabeth felt it. The chill. It started at the base of her spine and spread upward like frost creeping across glass. She turned, champagne flute paused halfway to her lips, and scanned the room. Laughter. Clinking glasses. The string quartet playing something soft and forgettable in the corner. Everything looked perfect. Everything felt wrong. Then she saw him. Theodore Voronkov stood near the grand staircase, half hidden in shadow despite the room's brilliant lighting. He wasn't trying to disappear. Men like him didn't need to try. He simply existed in a different frequency than everyone else, a darkness that light couldn't quite penetrate. His tuxedo was immaculate, tailored to perfection, but it looked like armor on him. His face was carved from stone, beautiful in the way that ancient statues were beautiful, cold, remote, untouchable. Elizabeth had seen him arrive earlier, watched the subtle ripple of fear that moved through the crowd as he entered. People smiled at Theodore Voronkov. They shook his hand. They thanked him for his family's generous donation to the children's hospital. But no one met his eyes for long. No one stood too close. She knew who he was, of course. Everyone did. The Voronkov name was whispered in boardrooms and back alleys alike. Legitimate businesses on the surface, real estate, import-export, private security. But underneath? The kind of power that didn't show up on tax returns. The kind that made district attorneys retire early and witnesses disappear. Theodore Voronkov was a monster in a bow tie, and he had the audacity to stand in her kingdom without so much as acknowledging her existence. Elizabeth felt something ugly twist in her chest. It wasn't fear. She'd never been afraid of anything except irrelevance. It was something worse. It was the realization that for the first time in years, she wasn't the most powerful person in the room. She drained her champagne and set the glass on a passing tray with more force than necessary. "Darling, you look murderous." Her manager, Craig, appeared at her elbow, his smile practiced and cautious. "What's wrong?" "Who invited him?" Elizabeth didn't need to point. Craig followed her gaze and immediately understood. The Voronkov Foundation is the primary sponsor. His mother specifically requested his mother. Elizabeth's laugh was sharp. How convenient. The family does charity work while the son does. What? Exactly. Craig shifted uncomfortably. Elizabeth, please. Don't. Don't what? Whatever you're thinking. Don't. But she was already thinking it, already feeling the familiar rush of performance adrenaline, the same high she got before stepping onto a stage. Theodore Voronkov thought he could stand there, silent and untouchable, radiating menace, while everyone tiptoed around him. He thought his reputation made him immune to the rules that governed everyone else. Elizabeth Finley had built her entire career on being the loudest voice in every room, on taking up space, on making sure everyone knew exactly who was in control. And right now, Theodore Voronkov's very presence was a challenge to everything she'd built. He needs to be brought down a peg, she murmured. Elizabeth, he's at a charity gala. A celebration of art and culture. He should participate, don't you think? She was already moving, her heels clicking against marble like a countdown. Craig grabbed her arm. You don't know what you're dealing with. These aren't record executives or rival pop stars. This is a man. Elizabeth pulled free, her smile returning, sharp and beautiful. Just a man who thinks he's above it all. Watch. She made her way to the stage, greeting guests as she moved, her performance face perfect. Inside, her heart raced with the thrill of it. This was better than any scripted concert. This was real. Raw. Dangerous. The thought should have stopped her. It didn't. Elizabeth climbed the stage steps and caught the attention of the bandleader with a practiced gesture. The music softened. Conversations began to quiet. People turned toward the stage, expecting another song, another gift from their golden girl. She lifted the microphone, her smile radiant. Ladies and gentlemen, isn't this evening just magnificent? Applause. But I think we can make it even more special. You see, we have so many talented people in this room. So much hidden potential. Her eyes found Theodore across the ballroom. He was watching her now, his expression unchanged, but she felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. I believe in sharing the spotlight, in giving everyone a chance to shine. The room was completely silent now. Theodore Voronkov, Elizabeth's voice rang out like a bell, clear and cruel and wrapped in honey. Won't you come sing for us? The silence that followed Elizabeth's invitation was absolute. Not the polite hush of an audience waiting for a performance. Not the anticipatory quiet before applause. This was the silence of held breath and stopped hearts, the kind that preceded either miracles or massacres. Elizabeth stood center stage, microphone in hand, her smile never wavering. She looked like an angel painted in gold, her dress catching the light in 1,000 different ways, her face luminous with false warmth. But her eyes were fixed on Theodore Voronkov with the focus of a predator that had just selected its prey. Around the ballroom, guests turned to look at the man in question. Some turned quickly, eager to witness what would happen next. Others moved slowly, reluctantly, as if afraid that even looking might make them complicit in whatever was about to unfold. Theodore hadn't moved. He remained exactly where he'd been standing, one hand resting casually in his pocket, the other holding a glass of champagne he'd barely touched. His face revealed nothing, no surprise, no anger, no embarrassment. He simply looked at Elizabeth with those dark, unreadable eyes, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Craig was gesturing frantically from the side of the stage, making cutting motions across his throat. Stop. Stop now. But Elizabeth had never been good at stopping once she'd started. That was what made her great. That was what made her dangerous. Don't be shy, she continued, her voice playful, teasing. We're all friends here. All one big, happy family supporting a wonderful cause. She let the microphone drift slightly, her head tilting in a gesture that photographers had captured 1,000 times, coy, challenging, irresistible. Besides, I heard a rumor that you have quite the voice, Mr. Voronkov. Hidden talents, they say. That was a lie. She'd heard no such thing. But the crowd didn't know that, and now they were leaning in, curious despite their fear. A woman in diamonds whispered something to her husband. A tech mogul pulled out his phone, then thought better of it and slipped it back into his pocket. The string quartet had stopped playing entirely, their instruments hanging forgotten in their hands. Theodore set down his champagne glass on a nearby table. The soft click of crystal against marble echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. He began to walk. Each step was measured, deliberate, unhurried. He moved through the crowd like Moses through the Red Sea. People parted before him without being asked, creating a path from the staircase to the stage. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. Elizabeth's smile widened. This was it. This was the moment she would prove that even the most feared man in the city was just a man. That her power, the power of the spotlight, of public opinion, of performance, was greater than his power of violence and intimidation. She would make him stumble, make him falter, expose the brutishness beneath the expensive suit. The crowd would laugh. Not openly, perhaps. Not at first. But they would smile behind their hands, would share knowing glances, would remember that Elizabeth Finley had done what none of them dared to do. She had made Theodore Voronkov look small. Her career would soar. This moment would trend worldwide before the night was over. The diva who humbled the mob boss. The queen who reminded a king that culture and art would always triumph over crude force. Theodore reached the stage steps. Craig had gone pale, backing away from the stage like a man retreating from a fire. Other guests were edging toward the exits, their survival instincts finally overriding their curiosity. But most stayed, transfixed, unable to look away from what was about to happen. Theodore climbed the steps with the same unhurried grace he'd used to cross the ballroom. Up close, he was taller than Elizabeth had realized. Broader. There was a scar along his jawline, barely visible, the kind that spoke of violence survived rather than avoided. His hands looked like they'd been carved from marble, elegant but hard, capable of signing checks or breaking bones with equal ease. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated, cedar and smoke. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, Elizabeth felt something she refused to name flicker in her chest. Not fear. Never fear. But perhaps uncertainty. You want me to sing, Theodore said. His voice was low, accented Russian, she thought, though softened by years in America. It wasn't a question. I insist, Elizabeth replied, her smile sharp enough to cut. She held out the microphone like a challenge, like a gauntlet thrown. Theodore looked at the microphone for a long moment. Then his gaze traveled slowly across the ballroom, taking in every face, every camera, every witness to this moment. People flinched under his attention, looking away, suddenly fascinated by their champagne or their shoes or anything that wasn't him. When his eyes returned to Elizabeth, something had changed in them. Something almost like amusement, though it was impossible to tell if he was laughing with her or at her. What would you like me to sing? He asked. The question caught her off guard. She'd expected refusal, expected anger, expected him to turn and walk away so she could mock his cowardice. She hadn't expected cooperation. Whatever you know, she said quickly, recovering. I'm sure anything will be adequate. Adequate. The word was meant to sting, to establish that whatever he produced would be measured against her standard and found wanting. Theodore's lips curved into something that might have been a smile if smiles could hold knives. Very well, he said, and took the microphone from her hand. His fingers brushed hers for just a second, warm, steady, completely calm, and Elizabeth felt electricity shoot up her arm. Theodore turned to face the crowd, and the ballroom held its breath once more. Theodore stood at the microphone, silent and still, while the ballroom waited. Elizabeth stepped back, giving him the stage, her smile fixed and confident. She'd already won, she told herself. The moment he opened his mouth and produced whatever rough, untrained sound a man like him might manage, the audience would understand. Power came in many forms, but art, true art, required years of discipline, of sacrifice, of talent that couldn't be bought or intimidated into existence. Theodore Voronkov was a king of violence. But this was her kingdom. He closed his eyes. The gesture seemed almost intimate, vulnerable in a way that didn't match anything Elizabeth knew about him. His shoulders relaxed slightly. His chest expanded with a slow, controlled breath. And when he opened his mouth, when that first note emerged, the world stopped. It was a low note, impossibly low, a baritone that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the earth itself. Rich and dark like aged wine, like smoke, like velvet dragged across gravel. But it wasn't rough. It wasn't untrained. It was perfect. The note held steady, unwavering, filled with a vibrato so controlled it sounded like the resonance of a cello. It rolled through the ballroom like thunder, like a storm approaching from a distance, and every person in that room felt it in their chest, in their bones, in places they didn't know music could reach. Elizabeth's smile froze. Theodore's eyes remained closed, his face serene, almost peaceful. He looked like a different person, not the cold, dangerous man who'd walked through the crowd moments before, but someone else entirely. Someone who'd been hiding beneath the violence and the reputation, waiting. He moved to the next note, climbing higher, and the sound that came out shouldn't have been possible. It was operatic, trained, refined beyond anything Elizabeth had expected, beyond anything she'd feared. The melody was familiar Puccini, she realized with a jolt of recognition. Nessun Dorma. One of the most demanding pieces in the classical repertoire, a tenor's showcase that required power and precision in equal measure. But Theodore was singing it as a baritone, transposing it down to fit his range, and somehow making it more haunting, more powerful, more devastating than she'd ever heard it. Elizabeth felt something crack inside her chest. The audience had gone from frozen in fear to frozen in awe. Phones came out now, not furtively but openly, desperately trying to capture what was happening. A woman near the front had tears streaming down her face. A renowned music critic stood with his mouth slightly open, his champagne glass tilted at a dangerous angle, forgotten. Theodore reached the climactic phrase, his voice soaring, filling every corner of the massive ballroom with a sound so pure, so powerful, that the chandeliers seemed to tremble. He hit notes that Elizabeth herself struggled with, notes that lived at the edge of human capability, and he hit them with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. In conservatories. In concert halls. In a life that existed before whatever had turned him into what he was now. Elizabeth stood 3 feet away from him, close enough to see the concentration on his face, the technical precision in every breath, every phrase. This wasn't talent. This was training. Years of it. The kind of training that started in childhood, that consumed entire lives, that only the most dedicated musicians ever achieved. Who was he? The question screamed through her mind as Theodore's voice climbed higher still, reaching for the famous final note. The note that separated good tenors from great ones. The note that audiences waited for, held their breath for, judged everything else against. He held it. God help her, he held it for what felt like an eternity, the sound pure and unwavering, resonating through the space like a bell struck in a cathedral. The note hung in the air, impossibly sustained, technically flawless, and when he finally let it fade, when the last vibration of sound dissolved into silence, the applause was deafening. It erupted from every corner of the ballroom, a wall of sound that rivaled anything Elizabeth had received after her own performance. People surged to their feet, their fear of Theodore Voronkov momentarily forgotten in their shock and wonder. The standing ovation went on and on, champagne glasses raised, voices shouting "Bravo" in genuine amazement. Theodore opened his eyes. He looked directly at Elizabeth, and in that gaze she saw everything she'd tried to avoid seeing. He wasn't a brute. He wasn't simple. He wasn't someone who could be humiliated by being forced onto a stage. He was her equal. Perhaps more than her equal. And he'd just proven it in front of everyone who mattered. Theodore held out the microphone, offering it back to her with a gesture that looked polite but felt like a gauntlet being thrown. His expression hadn't changed, still calm, still unreadable, but there was something in his eyes now. A challenge. A question. Your move. Elizabeth took the microphone with numb fingers. Her mouth was dry. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it over the applause. Every instinct screamed at her to say something, to reclaim the moment, to turn this somehow back to her advantage. But for the first time in her entire career, Elizabeth Finley had absolutely no idea what to do. Theodore gave her the smallest nod, acknowledgement or mockery, she couldn't tell, and walked off the stage, descending the steps with the same unhurried grace he'd used to climb them. The crowd parted for him again, but this time it wasn't fear that moved them. It was respect. What would you have done if you were Elizabeth in that moment? Fight back or retreat? Drop your answer below and subscribe for the next chapter. Elizabeth found him in the shadows backstage, where the chandelier's glow didn't reach and the applause was just a distant murmur through velvet curtains. He stood with his back to her, looking out a tall window that overlooked the city, his city, she thought bitterly. The skyline glittered below like scattered diamonds, lights reflecting off glass and steel, a kingdom built on secrets and blood money. Theodore's reflection in the window was motionless, hands clasped behind his back, waiting. He'd known she would follow. You bastard. Elizabeth's voice came out raw, stripped of the honey and polish she used for cameras. This was the real voice, the one that lived beneath the performance. You set me up. Theodore turned slowly, and even here in the dim backstage light, his face remained maddeningly composed. I did nothing. You invited me to sing. I sang. Don't. She stepped closer, her gold dress whispering against the floor. Her carefully styled hair had come slightly loose, curls falling around her face, and she didn't care. Didn't care about the photographers who'd tried to follow her, didn't care about Craig's desperate calls on her phone, didn't care about anything except the humiliation burning through her veins like acid. Don't pretend this wasn't planned. You knew. You knew exactly what you were doing up there. Yes. The admission came without hesitation. I did. Where did you learn to sing like that? The question burst from her like an accusation. Who are you? Something flickered across Theodore's face, so brief she almost missed it. Pain, maybe. Or memory. But it was gone before she could name it, replaced by that infuriating calm. Does it matter? Yes, it fucking matters. Elizabeth's voice rose, echoing off the walls. You're supposed to be, everyone knows what you are. What you do. You don't get to also be, she stopped, choking on the words she didn't want to say. Better than you? Theodore finished quietly. The words hit like a slap. Elizabeth recoiled, her breath catching. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. He moved away from the window, closer to her, and she hated that she had to look up to meet his eyes. Hated that, even in heels, even in her armor of sequins and fame, he made her feel small. You brought me on stage to humiliate me. To prove that your talent, your art, made you superior to a man like me. A killer. A monster. You are a monster. But the words sounded weak now, unconvincing even to her own ears. Yes, Theodore agreed. I am. Now. But I wasn't always. The admission hung in the air between them. Elizabeth stared at him, her anger faltering, replaced by something more dangerous. Curiosity. What does that mean? Theodore was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as if deciding how much to reveal. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost distant, as if he were speaking to himself rather than to her. I was born in St. Petersburg. My father wanted me to follow him into the family business. Even then, it was the family business. But my mother had other plans. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. She was a soprano. She sang at the Mariinsky Theater. She believed that music could save anything, anyone. Even the son of a man like my father. Elizabeth said nothing. Couldn't. The image forming in her mind didn't match the man standing before her, the man whose name made district attorneys nervous and witnesses disappear. She started my training when I was 4 years old. Voice lessons, music theory, piano. By the time I was 8, I was performing in competitions. By 12, I had been accepted to the Moscow Conservatory. His eyes focused on something far away, something she couldn't see. I was going to be the greatest baritone of my generation. That's what they said. That's what I believed. What happened? Elizabeth's voice was barely a whisper. My father happened. Theodore's expression hardened. He was killed when I was 17. Gunned down in the street like an animal. And suddenly, the family business needed a new head. My mother begged me not to. She said I could still choose music, still choose a different life. But you didn't. No. The word was final, absolute. I had a younger sister. Cousins. People who depended on the Voronkov name for protection. If I walked away, they would have been devoured by our enemies. So I put away the music. I learned different skills. How to negotiate. How to intimidate. How to kill when necessary. He looked at Elizabeth now, really looked at her, and she saw the truth in his eyes. The violence he'd committed. The things he'd done to survive, to protect, to build an empire on his father's grave. The conservatory sent letters for 2 years, Theodore continued, begging me to return. My teachers called. My mother cried. His voice dropped to something barely audible. Eventually, they stopped asking. I became what everyone expected me to become. What I needed to become. Elizabeth felt something crack in her chest, the same feeling she'd had when he'd hit that first perfect note. The realization that nothing about this man was simple. That beneath the monster was someone who'd sacrificed everything, including himself. Why did you sing tonight? She asked. You could have refused. You could have walked away. Theodore's eyes met hers, dark and unfathomable. Because you needed to learn that not everything is what it appears to be. Including me. Including you. What does that mean? It means you hide behind volume because you're afraid of being truly heard. You perform because you're terrified of being truly seen. He stepped closer, and Elizabeth's breath caught. You mock others to avoid examining yourself. You don't know anything about me. Don't I? His voice was soft, dangerous. You saw a monster and decided to make him dance for your amusement. But what you're really afraid of, Elizabeth Finley, is that the monster might see you for what you really are. And what's that? Afraid. Elizabeth didn't sleep that night. She lay in her penthouse suite, staring at the ceiling while the city hummed below, replaying every moment of the gala in excruciating detail. Theodore's voice. The look in his eyes when he'd called her afraid. The way the entire ballroom had risen to their feet for him, while she stood there like a fool holding a microphone that had become a weapon turned against herself. By morning, the internet had exploded. Videos of Theodore's performance had gone viral. 15 million views. 20 million. 30. Entertainment sites ran headlines she couldn't bear to read. Classical music blogs were demanding to know his training background. Speculation ran wild. Was he a former opera singer? A conservatory dropout? Someone's hidden protege? Her own performance that night, the one that had opened the gala to thunderous applause, was barely mentioned. Elizabeth sat at her breakfast table, untouched coffee growing cold, scrolling through her phone with mounting horror. Her publicist had called 6 times. Craig had sent a dozen increasingly frantic messages. But she couldn't bring herself to respond. What would she say? That she'd tried to humiliate a mafia boss and he'd destroyed her instead? The knock on her door came at exactly 10 o'clock. She almost didn't answer. But something, instinct, curiosity, the same reckless impulse that had made her call Theodore to the stage, made her cross the marble floor and open it. A man in a dark suit stood in the hallway. Not Theodore. Someone younger, with the same watchful eyes and controlled stillness that marked him as Voronkov's security. He held a cream-colored envelope with her name written in elegant script across the front. Miss Finley, he said with a slight accent. Mr. Voronkov requests your presence. Elizabeth's hand tightened on the door. Tell Mr. Voronkov I'm not interested in, it's not a social call. The man's expression didn't change. His mother would like to meet you. She's asked for a private performance. That stopped her. His mother. Mrs. Voronkov is very ill. She watched the video of last night's gala. She was moved by what transpired. He extended the envelope. The details are inside. A car will collect you this evening at 7. And if I refuse? The man's smile was polite and utterly cold. Mr. Voronkov hopes you won't. He would consider it a personal favor. And he pays his debts very generously. He turned and walked away before Elizabeth could respond, his footsteps silent on the carpeted hallway. Elizabeth stood in her doorway, holding the envelope, her mind racing. A personal favor. From Theodore Voronkov. The man whose favor could open doors or close them permanently. The man who now held something over her, the knowledge that she'd tried and failed to break him in front of the world. She opened the envelope. Inside was a card with an address in the countryside, an hour outside the city. And beneath it, in the same elegant handwriting, "My mother's time is short. She wishes to hear you sing before she dies. I'm told it's rude to refuse a dying woman's request. 7 o'clock. Don't be late." There was something else in the envelope. A newspaper clipping, old and yellowed, the paper thin as tissue. Elizabeth unfolded it carefully. The headline was in Russian, but there was a photograph, a young boy, perhaps 12 years old, standing on a concert stage in formal attire. Even in the grainy black and white image, she could see it was Theodore. His face softer, younger, but those same dark eyes staring into the camera with fierce intensity. At the bottom, someone had written a translation in pencil, "Voronkov prodigy stuns Moscow critics." The voice of a generation. Elizabeth stared at the clipping for a long time. Then she called Craig. "Tell me you're not actually considering this," he said when she explained. "Elizabeth, please. These people are dangerous. You've already poked the bear. Don't walk into his den. His mother is dying. His mother probably kills people too. This is the Voronkov family we're talking about." But Elizabeth had already made up her mind. She could hear it in her own voice, see it in her reflection in the window. She was going. Not because Theodore had asked. Not even because his mother was dying. She was going because she needed to understand. The car arrived precisely at 7. It was a black Mercedes, windows tinted, driver silent and professional. Elizabeth wore something simple, a navy dress, minimal jewelry. This wasn't a performance. At least, not the kind she was used to. They drove north, leaving the city's glittering skyline behind, winding through increasingly rural roads until civilization became scattered lights in the distance. The Voronkov estate appeared suddenly, rising from the darkness like something from a different era. Iron gates. Stone walls. A mansion that looked more like a fortress, surrounded by woods that pressed in from all sides. Security checked the car at 3 different points before they reached the main house. Theodore was waiting on the steps. He wore dark slacks and a white shirt, no jacket, sleeves rolled to his elbows. More casual than she'd ever seen him, but no less commanding. His expression was unreadable as the driver opened her door. "Thank you for coming," Theodore said, and if there was irony in the words, his tone didn't reveal it. "Did I have a choice?" "We always have choices, Miss Finley. We just don't always like the consequences of refusing." He gestured toward the entrance. Elizabeth climbed the steps, acutely aware of his presence beside her, the warmth radiating from his body in the cool evening air. "Your mother," Elizabeth said. "How ill is she?" "Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The doctors give her weeks. Maybe days." "I'm sorry." Theodore glanced at her, something shifting in his expression. "Are you?" "Yes." And surprisingly, she meant it. He nodded slowly, then pushed open the massive wooden doors. "Then come. She's been waiting." Would you accept Theodore's invitation, or would the danger keep you away? Subscribe to find out what Elizabeth discovers inside. The inside of the Voronkov mansion was not what Elizabeth expected. She'd imagined something cold and brutal, leather furniture, dark wood, the aesthetic of power wielded without apology. Instead, she stepped into a world suspended between 2 lives. The foyer was grand, marble floors polished to a mirror shine, a crystal chandelier casting soft light over walls lined with oil paintings. But it was the details that caught her attention. The Steinway grand piano positioned near tall windows overlooking the grounds. The framed concert programs on the walls. The music books stacked on antique side tables, their spines worn from use. This wasn't a gangster's fortress. This was a musician's home, preserved like a museum to a life that no longer existed. Theodore walked ahead of her, his footsteps echoing through the vast space. He didn't look at the piano as they passed, didn't acknowledge the programs on the walls, but Elizabeth saw the tension in his shoulders, the slight tightening of his jaw. Every step through this house was a reminder of what he'd given up. "My mother insisted on keeping everything," Theodore said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "After I took over the family business, she refused to let me remove a single music book. She said the house should remember who I was, even if I couldn't." Elizabeth's fingers trailed along the piano as they passed. The instrument was immaculate, perfectly maintained despite the years. "Do you still play?" "No." The word was final, absolute. A door closed and locked. They climbed a sweeping staircase, the walls lined with photographs. Elizabeth caught glimpses as they ascended Theodore as a child at a piano, his small hands stretched across the keys. Theodore in formal concert attire, holding a trophy. Theodore standing beside a beautiful woman with kind eyes and silver hair, both of them smiling, back when smiling seemed to come naturally to him. "That's her," Theodore said, pausing beside one particular photograph. "Opening night at the Mariinsky. She was singing Tosca. I was 14. It was the last time I saw her perform before we left Russia." The woman in the photograph wore a stunning gown, her arms raised in triumph as flowers rained down around her. The joy in her face was radiant, infectious. Elizabeth could see where Theodore had gotten his bone structure, his dark eyes, his presence. "She's beautiful." She was the most beautiful voice I'd ever heard. Theodore's expression softened, just fractionally. Until she got sick, she would still sing. Just around the house. Scales in the morning. Arias while she cooked. She said music was like breathing, you didn't stop just because life got hard. They reached the second floor, walking down a hallway lined with more photographs, more programs, more ghosts of the life Theodore had abandoned. He stopped before a heavy wooden door, his hand resting on the handle. "She's very weak," he said, his voice lower now. "The medication helps with the pain, but she drifts in and out. If she seems confused, just be patient." It was the first time Elizabeth had heard anything like vulnerability in his voice. Theodore opened the door. The room beyond was large but felt intimate, filled with soft lamplight and the faint scent of lavender. Medical equipment lined one wall, monitors for stands, oxygen tanks, the brutal machinery of dying rendered as unobtrusive as possible. But the rest of the room was carefully, lovingly arranged. Fresh flowers on every surface. More photographs. A small record player in the corner, classical music playing at barely audible volume. And in the center, in a hospital bed that looked obscene in its clinical functionality, lay Irina Voronkov. She was small, so much smaller than she'd appeared in the photographs. Illness had whittled her down to something fragile, translucent. But when she turned her head at the sound of the door opening, when her eyes found her son, the smile that crossed her face held all the radiance of the opera singer she'd once been. "Teddy," she said, her voice barely a whisper but rich with warmth. "You brought her." Theodore crossed to the bed immediately, taking his mother's hand with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a man Elizabeth had watched command a room through sheer intimidation. "Mama, this is Elizabeth Finley." "Elizabeth, my mother, Irina." Irina's gaze shifted to Elizabeth, and despite the pain etched into every line of her face, her eyes were sharp, assessing. "The famous diva who tried to embarrass my son." Elizabeth felt her cheeks flush. Mrs. Voronkov, I apologize." "I didn't," but Irina was laughing, a sound that dissolved into coughing. Theodore helped her sit up slightly, adjusting pillows, his movements practiced and tender. When she caught her breath, she was still smiling. "Don't apologize. It was the best thing anyone has done for him in 20 years. She reached out a thin hand toward Elizabeth. Come. Sit. Let me look at you. Elizabeth approached hesitantly, taking the offered hand. Irina's grip was weak but warm. I saw the video, Irina continued. Watched it 12 times. I haven't heard my son sing since the night his father died. I thought I never would again. Tears filled her eyes. You gave me a gift, Miss Finley. Even if you didn't mean to. Mama, Theodore started, but Irina waved him off. Hush. I'm dying. I can say what I want. She turned back to Elizabeth. He told you about the conservatory? Yes. Did he tell you he was the youngest student ever accepted? That Dmitry Hvorostovsky himself said Teddy would surpass him. Mama, please, that he gave it all up to protect this family? Irina's voice grew stronger, fueled by some reservoir of strength that transcended her failing body. That he buried his dreams so his sister could live? So I could be safe. Elizabeth looked at Theodore. He stood rigidly beside the bed, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on something out the window. A muscle worked in his cheek. I didn't know, Elizabeth said softly. No one does. Irina squeezed her hand. He doesn't let them. He plays the monster so well that everyone forgets the man underneath. She paused, her breathing labored. But I haven't forgotten. And now, neither have you. Theodore moved to adjust his mother's oxygen, his hands shaking almost imperceptibly. Will you sing for me? Irina asked Elizabeth. Not a performance. Just something beautiful. Something that reminds me why I believed music could save the world. Elizabeth felt tears prick her own eyes. She nodded. What would you like to hear? Irina smiled. Sing with my son. A duet. Let me hear both of you together. Theodore's head snapped up. Mama, I don't please Teddy. Irina's voice was fading now, exhaustion claiming her. One last time. Let me hear my boy sing. Elizabeth watched Theodore's face, watched him struggle against every wall he'd built around himself. Then, slowly, he nodded. They moved to the music room on the first floor, leaving Irina to rest with a nurse watching over her. Elizabeth followed Theodore down the hallway in silence, her mind still reeling from the woman upstairs. The way Irina had looked at her son. The way Theodore had held his mother's hand like she was made of glass. The raw grief just beneath the surface of his control. The music room was smaller than the main foyer, but no less stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked gardens that were invisible in the darkness. Another grand piano dominated the space, this one older, more lived in. Sheet music covered the stand, edges yellowed with age. A cello rested in one corner. Shelves lined the walls, packed with scores and books in multiple languages. This was where the music had happened. Where Theodore had trained, practiced, dreamed. We should choose something simple, Elizabeth said, breaking the silence. She was desperate to fill the quiet, to cover the strange intimacy of being alone with him in this room full of ghosts. Maybe something from Your Technique is Sloppy. Elizabeth stopped mid-sentence. Excuse me. Theodore had moved to the piano, his fingers resting on the closed lid. He didn't look at her. Your breathing. Your vowel placement. The way you push from your throat instead of your diaphragm. It's all wrong. Heat flooded her face. I'm one of the best-selling artists in the world. You're one of the loudest. Now he did look at her, his dark eyes steady and clinical. That's not the same thing. How dare you, sing something for me. Right now. No microphone. No backing track. Just your voice. It wasn't a request. Elizabeth's hands clenched at her sides. Every instinct screamed to refuse, to walk out, to tell him exactly where he could shove his critique. But something else held her in place. The same reckless curiosity that had brought her here. The need to know if he was right. She opened her mouth and began one of her hit songs, the chorus that had topped charts in 15 countries. Theodore held up a hand after 4 bars. Stop. What? You're yelling. You're not singing. He crossed to her, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. You have power, yes. Volume. But no control. No nuance. You sing like someone afraid that if you're not the loudest person in the room, you'll disappear. The words cut deeper than they should have. Elizabeth felt something crack in her chest. I've had training. Years of it. Pop training. Performance training. You've been taught to entertain, not to connect. Theodore circled her slowly, assessing. You've built a career on spectacle. But your mother wants to hear music, not a stadium show. Then teach me. The words came out before Elizabeth could stop them, sharp and challenging. If you're so much better than me, show me how it's done. Theodore's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Very well. He moved behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body against her back. First, your posture. You're too rigid. His hands touched her shoulders, firm but not rough, adjusting her stance. Elizabeth's breath caught. Relax. You're not performing for a camera. You're sharing something true. His hands moved to her ribcage. Breathe from here. Deep. Let me feel your ribs expand. Elizabeth inhaled, hyper-aware of his hands on her body, the warmth of his breath near her ear. Her ribs expanded under his palms. Good. Again. Deeper. She breathed, and this time felt something shift. The air went lower, fuller, steadier than the shallow performer's breaths she usually took. Now sing. But quietly. Imagine you're singing to one person in a small room, not thousands in an arena. Elizabeth began again, softer this time. But after 2 lines, Theodore stopped her. You're still pushing. Still forcing. His voice was close to her ear, low and patient in a way that made her shiver. The power doesn't come from pressure. It comes from support. From letting the sound resonate instead of manufacturing it. I don't understand. You're trying to prove something with every note. That you're good enough. That you belong. That you're worth listening to. His hands tightened slightly on her ribs. Stop trying. Just be. I don't know how to do that. Yes, you do. You just forgot. Theodore stepped around to face her, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. You became famous very young, didn't you? Elizabeth nodded. 16. I won a talent show. Record deal by 17. And they told you to be louder. Bigger. More commercial. They told me to be marketable. They told you to hide. Theodore's eyes held hers. You learned to perform instead of feel. To entertain instead of communicate. You built armor out of volume. Elizabeth felt tears threatening. And you built armor out of violence. Yes. The admission was quiet, honest. But right now, in this room, we can both take off our armor. Just for a moment. He moved to the piano, settling onto the bench. His hands hovered over the keys, hesitant, as if touching them might burn. Then he pressed down, and a chord filled the room. Rich. Warm. Perfect. Ave Maria, he said. Schubert. Do you know it? Elizabeth nodded. Every singer knew it. But she'd never attempted it, too classical, too far from her brand. Theodore began to play, the melody achingly beautiful in the quiet room. Then he started to sing, his baritone filling the space with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a man like him. No performance. No spectacle. Just pure, unguarded emotion pouring through music. He reached the bridge and stopped, looking at her. Waiting. Elizabeth closed her eyes. She thought of Irina upstairs, dying, wanting to hear her son sing one last time. She thought of Theodore at 12, standing on a Moscow stage with the world at his feet. She thought of her own 16-year-old self, before the fame, before the armor, when singing had been about joy instead of validation. And she sang. Quietly. Honestly. Not projecting to the back row of a stadium, but sharing something intimate and true. Her voice blended with Theodore's, finding harmony she'd never attempted before, supported by breathing she'd forgotten she knew how to do. Theodore's eyes met hers over the piano, and something passed between them. Recognition. Understanding. 2 people who'd spent years hiding behind their reputations, finally allowing themselves to be seen. The music swelled. Elizabeth felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't stop. Didn't pull back. She let the emotion flow through the notes, let the vulnerability show, let herself be real for the first time in years. When the final chord faded, silence filled the room. Theodore stood slowly, crossing to where she stood. He reached up and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb, the gesture achingly gentle. That, he said softly, is your real voice. The first crack of thunder made Elizabeth jump. She turned toward the windows as rain began to hit the glass in heavy sheets, the storm arriving with the sudden violence of summer weather. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the gardens in stark white flashes before plunging them back into darkness. "It came out of nowhere," Elizabeth murmured, wrapping her arms around herself. The temperature had dropped, or maybe it was just the adrenaline from singing fading, leaving her exposed and cold. Theodore moved to the windows, watching the storm with an expression she couldn't read. "Nothing comes out of nowhere. We just don't see it building until it breaks." Elizabeth wondered if he was still talking about the weather. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. The room plunged into darkness broken only by lightning flashes and the faint glow from a backup generator somewhere deeper in the house. Emergency lighting kicked in after a moment, casting everything in dim amber shadows. "The nurse has emergency power in my mother's room," Theodore said, anticipating her question. "She's safe." They stood in the half-darkness, the storm raging outside, the silence between them charged with something neither seemed ready to name. The intimacy of the duet still hung in the air, the vulnerability, the honesty, the feeling of masks finally removed. "Play something else," Elizabeth said. She didn't want to leave this room. Didn't want to return to the world outside where she was Elizabeth Finley, pop star, and he was Theodore Voronkov, monster. Here, in the darkness, they could be something else. Something truer. Theodore returned to the piano, his movements fluid in the low light. He sat and, after a moment's hesitation, began to play. Not classical this time. Something else. Jazz, she realized. A standard she recognized but couldn't immediately name. "You play jazz?" She moved closer, drawn by the music. "My mother believed in versatility. Opera, classical, jazz, even pop." His fingers moved across the keys with easy confidence, the muscle memory of thousands of hours of practice. She said a true musician could find beauty in any form. "The very thought of you," Elizabeth recognized the song now. Nat King Cole, among others. Theodore's voice was soft, almost lost beneath the music and the storm. "Sing it." It wasn't a command this time. It was an invitation. Elizabeth began to sing, her voice wrapping around the melody like silk. The lyrics spoke of longing, of someone who haunted every thought, every moment. She sang them to the darkness, to the storm, to the man at the piano who'd somehow stripped away every defense she'd spent years building. Theodore joined her on the second verse, his baritone weaving beneath her soprano, supporting and challenging in equal measure. They weren't competing anymore. They were conversing, two voices in dialogue, saying things with music that neither could speak aloud. The song built, their voices rising together, filling the shadowed room with sound and emotion and dangerous truth. Elizabeth found herself moving closer to the piano, unable to stop herself, drawn by gravity or madness or something she didn't have a name for. Theodore's eyes found hers in the dimness. He kept playing, kept singing, but she saw something shift in his expression. The same thing she felt building in her chest, a storm to match the one outside, pressure increasing until something had to break. The song ended. The final chord hung in the air. Neither of them moved. Elizabeth. Her name on his lips was a question, a warning, a confession. She should leave. Should thank him politely for the lesson, for the duet, for showing her mother what she wanted to see. Should walk out of this house and never look back, return to her world of spotlights and stadium shows and carefully controlled performances. Instead, she closed the distance between them. Theodore stood from the piano bench, and suddenly they were inches apart, the air crackling with the same electricity as the storm outside. Lightning flashed, illuminating his face, the strong jaw, the scar, the eyes that held too many secrets and too much pain. "This is a mistake," he said, but he didn't move away. "Probably." Elizabeth's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm not a good man. I know. I've done things that would horrify you. I know that too." Then why? She kissed him. Or he kissed her. Later, neither of them would be able to say who moved first. It didn't matter. What mattered was the way his hands came up to frame her face, gentle despite their capability for violence. The way her fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, desperate and reckless. The way they both stopped thinking, stopped performing, stopped being anything except two people who'd recognized something in each other that the rest of the world couldn't see. The kiss was nothing like Elizabeth expected. She'd kissed plenty of men, actors, musicians, brief flings that meant nothing and were forgotten by morning. But this was different. This was Theodore pouring years of loneliness into the contact, all the music he'd buried, all the softness he'd had to kill to survive. And she was answering with her own truth, her own fear, her own desperate need to be seen as something more than a voice and a brand. Thunder crashed overhead. The storm intensified. And they kissed like the world was ending, like this moment was all they had, like tomorrow they'd both have to put their armor back on, but tonight, just tonight, they could be honest. Theodore's hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer. Elizabeth gasped against his mouth, and he took advantage, deepening the kiss until she forgot her name, forgot the cameras, forgot everything except the feeling of his body against hers, and the way he touched her like she was something precious instead of something to be consumed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elizabeth rested her forehead against his chest. She could feel his heart pounding, as wild and uncontrolled as her own. "This changes nothing," Theodore said, but his arms were still around her, holding her like he had no intention of letting go. "Liar," Elizabeth whispered. He laughed, actually laughed, the sound rough and surprised, as if he'd forgotten how. "Yes, I suppose I am." Lightning flashed again, and in that brief moment of illumination, Elizabeth saw his face. The defenses down. The mask removed. The man instead of the monster. She reached up and kissed him again, softer this time, slower. A promise instead of a confession. And Theodore kissed her back like a man who'd been lost in darkness for 20 years and had finally, impossibly, found light. The storm raged on outside. But in the music room, surrounded by the ghosts of the life Theodore had abandoned, something new was being born. Something neither of them had planned for. Something that terrified them both. Something that felt dangerously like hope. Would you risk everything for a connection this powerful, or would you walk away? Comment your thoughts and subscribe for the final chapter. Irina Voronkov passed away 3 days after the storm. Elizabeth learned about it from the news, sitting in her penthouse with cold coffee and her phone clutched in her hand. The obituary was respectful, mentioning her illustrious career at the Mariinsky, her charitable work, her devotion to the arts. It mentioned her son only briefly survived by Theodore Voronkov, philanthropist and businessman. No mention of the Mafia. No mention of the violence. Just the sanitized version of their lives that money and power could buy. Elizabeth stared at Theodore's number in her phone for an hour before finally calling. He answered on the first ring. Elizabeth. Just her name. But she heard everything beneath it: exhaustion, grief, something that might have been relief that she'd called. "I'm so sorry. Your mother was extraordinary." Silence. Then, quietly, she asked about you. At the end. Wanted to know if you'd sing at her funeral. Elizabeth's throat tightened. Of course. Anything. No. Theodore's voice was firm. I won't make you perform your grief. I've asked enough of you, Theodore, but I would like you there. If you're willing, I'll be there. The funeral was small, private, held in a chapel that was probably older than the city itself. Elizabeth wore black and arrived early, slipping into a back pew before the other mourners arrived. She watched Theodore greet guests with the same controlled composure he wore like armor. Dignified, distant. The perfect mask. But when his eyes found hers across the chapel, something shifted. Just for a moment. Just enough for her to see the man beneath the monster. The service was beautiful. A string quartet played Schubert. A soprano from the Metropolitan Opera sang Ave Maria, her voice pure and achingly sad. People spoke about Irina's legacy, her passion, her unwavering belief in the power of music to transform lives. Theodore didn't speak. He sat in the front pew, his sister beside him, his face carved from stone. But Elizabeth saw his hands, clenched tight on his knees, knuckles white with the effort of holding himself together. When it was over, when the other mourners had offered their condolences and drifted away, Elizabeth approached him. His sister had stepped away to speak with the priest, leaving Theodore alone. "She loved you very much," Elizabeth said softly. "I know." Theodore's voice was rough, scraped raw. "I disappointed her anyway." "No. You saved her. You saved your whole family." She knew that. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Elizabeth saw the grief threatening to break through his control. "She wanted me to sing at the funeral. I couldn't. I tried, but I know." Elizabeth took his hand. In front of everyone. In front of the mourners still lingering, the photographers waiting outside, the world that would judge and speculate and turn this moment into headlines. She didn't care. Theodore's fingers tightened around hers. "The spring charity concert is in 2 weeks. The event my family sponsors every year. I'm expected to attend." "Then attend. Come with me." It wasn't a question. "Not as my guest. As my partner." Elizabeth understood what he was asking. To appear together publicly, deliberately, would tell the world that something had changed. That the pop star and the Mafia boss were no longer rivals, but allies. That whatever had started at the gala had become something neither of them could walk away from. It was dangerous. Reckless. It would raise questions she wasn't sure how to answer. "Yes," she said anyway. The spring charity concert was held at the same venue as the Metropolitan Gala, but everything about it felt different this time. Elizabeth arrived with Theodore, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. She wore crimson, a bold choice, a statement. Theodore was in black, as always, but he looked different somehow. Less like a shadow and more like a man who'd finally decided to step into the light. The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Whispers rippled through the ballroom like wildfire. Phones appeared. Cameras flashed. Every eye in the room tracked their entrance, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Elizabeth Finley and Theodore Voronkov. Together. Not as adversaries. Not as a publicity stunt. As equals. Craig materialized out of the crowd, his expression hovering between horror and resignation. "Elizabeth. We need to talk about the optics." "No," she said simply. "We don't. The press is going to have a field day, let them." Elizabeth felt Theodore's hand settle on the small of her back, steady and warm. "I'm done performing for people who don't matter." Theodore guided her through the crowd, and Elizabeth noticed something remarkable. People still parted for him, but differently now. There was still respect, still caution, but also something new. Curiosity. Interest. As if seeing him with her had made him human in a way his reputation never had. They found their table, and Elizabeth saw the program. The evening's entertainment was listed: several performers, a string quartet, and at the end, special performance by Theodore Voronkov and Elizabeth Finley. She looked at him. "You planned this." "I made a suggestion." The organizers were enthusiastic. His lips curved slightly. "Apparently the video of our last performance has over 100 million views now. They're calling it the performance of the decade." No pressure then, none at all. The evening progressed with speeches and performances, but Elizabeth barely heard any of it. She was too aware of Theodore beside her, his hand occasionally finding hers under the table, the way he leaned close to murmur observations that made her smile despite the butterflies in her stomach. This was different from the gala. Then, she'd been trying to destroy him. Now, she was trying to build something with him. Something that had no blueprint, no precedent, no guarantee of success. When their names were called, they rose together. The walk to the stage felt like stepping into a new world. No hostility this time. No competition. Just two people who'd found something unexpected in each other and decided it was worth the risk. Theodore took his place at the piano. Elizabeth stood beside it, her hand resting on the polished wood. They'd rehearsed once, briefly, choosing a piece that played to both their strengths. The opening notes filled the ballroom: Gershwin's Summertime. Jazz and classical, pop and opera, a bridge between their two worlds. Elizabeth sang the opening verse, her voice softer than her usual stadium performance, more intimate. Real. The way Theodore had taught her. He joined on the second verse, his baritone weaving beneath her soprano, their voices finding harmonies that felt inevitable, like they'd been singing together for years instead of days. The audience was transfixed. This wasn't the spectacle of the gala. This was artistry. Genuine connection. Two people who'd stopped pretending and started being honest. As they sang, Elizabeth realized something. She'd spent her entire career trying to be the loudest voice in the room, terrified that silence meant irrelevance. But Theodore had shown her something different. That power came from truth. That greatness came from vulnerability. That the real voice, the one that mattered, was the one she'd been hiding all along. The final note hung in the air, then dissolved into thunderous applause. But Elizabeth barely heard it. She was looking at Theodore, and he was looking back, and in that moment the rest of the world disappeared. They'd both spent years in cages of their own making. Hers built from insecurity. His from duty and violence. But standing here, singing together, they'd found a way out. The applause continued. Theodore stood, taking her hand, and they bowed together. Partners. Equals. A power couple the world would be afraid to touch. But more than that, two people who'd finally found the courage to be seen. Thank you for listening until the very end. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the story. There's another story like the one you just enjoyed on your left screen.